In my video on Trump's first 50 days of foreign policy, I talked about the radical changes to the way the United States is operating with Donald Trump as president. The threatened annexations of Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, and Gaza Strip, the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China, and, as I am writing this script, everyone else, the hostility towards Ukraine and NATO alongside a favoring of Russia, and what appears to be the end of U.S. soft power and the shuttering of U.S. aid. I mentioned how all of these shifts have the net effect of weakening the United States, but that isn't what Trump's intentions are. He sees these as winning plays. So why is he making them? Well, that has to do with how Trump and his administration view the world and foreign policy. It's not one size fits all, but there are several interlocking facets that explain all of these shifts, treating foreign policy as transactional, a zero-sum worldview, and Trump and his administration's views on power. But before talking about Trump's foreign policy views, we need to establish the United States of America's historical foreign policy. I need to note here at the start that in the foreign policy world, there is very little room for morality as a guiding principle. One of the best shorthands is this: foreign policy isn't about morality, it's about power. To be clear, when I say that, I am making a descriptive statement, not a prescriptive one. That is to say, I am describing how foreign policy currently works, not the ideal of how we should want it to. At the end of the last video, I noted how the United States' global power is predicated on its alliance networks, global bases, and global trade. There were two other components I should have mentioned. First, the US dollar as the reserve currency of choice in the world, and second, the system of international law. Now, make no mistake, the US has never been above breaking treaties, betraying allies, overthrowing uncooperative governments, and bending or outright breaking international law. When they can get away with it, other countries and non-state actors operate under a similar mindset. Remember, foreign policy isn't about morality, it's about power. But these cases of breaking the rules, as it were, only make strategic sense for a country or non-state actor if it increases their power in the long term. When it comes to the United States, their geopolitical position, military forces, and financial wealth allows them to do it more than most. In short, while the US absolutely breaks the rules in the rules-based world order, its power is still predicated on broad adherence to that rules-based world order. One of the most important principles in the post-World War II world that even the United States of America has, almost always, adhered to, is the permanence of borders under international law, changeable through mutual recognition by the countries in question, but not military invasion and annexation. Instead, nations are free to go about their business and have internal struggles for control that outside powers may interfere in on behalf of their preferred side so they can extract the country's resources or gain advantageous geopolitical positions. Did I just say that out loud? I did, didn't I? Well, in case you had any illusions, that was pretty much the foundation of US foreign policy during the Cold War. You see, rather than conquer and annex territory, the United States, and USSR, but we're not talking about them right now, promoted or installed governments agreeable to their interests around the world. This was usually done under the banner of preventing the spread of communism, or I suppose in the USSR's case, spreading communism. Simultaneously, within Europe, there was a strong emphasis on the promotion of democracy, especially targeted at Warsaw Pact countries. This wasn't out of altruism, but a way of breaking the USSR's hold over Eastern Europe. One of the downstream effects was that by the 1980s, authoritarian regimes around the world started shifting towards democracy. South Korea, Taiwan, Chile, Argentina, Brazil all followed this trend. It is this shift that has come to more broadly, though obviously not always, define America's foreign policy in the post-Cold War world, along with the promotion of market economies, i.e., capitalism. And this is ultimately how the modern rules-based world order benefits the United States of America. Virtually every country in the world is now part of the global capitalist system, which the USA is the center of. Lopsided trade with countries like China are pointed to as other countries taking advantage of the US, but what isn't taken into account is the amount of investment that is put back into the United States from these countries, including buying debt at sometimes shockingly low interest rates. The net effect of these two components is that Americans are able to buy more goods more cheaply than they otherwise would be able to, and America is able to borrow more money more cheaply than they otherwise would be able to. On that latter point, the US has definitely been squandering that potential, but historically it has meant that the United States isn't as a country penalized for having a trade deficit. Simultaneously, it strengthens the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. A reserve currency is money a central bank or other financial institution has on hand from another country. It has several purposes, among which is a means of international transactions and as a stable store of value. For the United States, having the dominant reserve currency, close to 60% of all global reserves at time of writing, allows the US to print more money without the same level of devaluation, to borrow money more cheaply, and provides tools for initiating economic sanctions. When I mentioned at the end of my last video the United States global power being predicated on its global trade network, these were some of the underlying systems that maintain that trade power and have been critical components of US foreign policy since the end of World War II. As has the international system of alliances that has been built up since the founding of NATO. At time of writing, the United States has alliances with 32 NATO and 20 major non-NATO countries around the world. That doesn't even include important regional partners like Panama, United Arab Emirates, or India. By having these alliances and partnerships, it offers mutual security both for US allies and the United States itself. There has been a persistent talking point about how NATO countries aren't carrying their weight because of a failure to meet a 2% of GDP threshold on military spending. However, in recent years, there have been significant increases in spending by virtually all NATO countries, in part due to the threat of Russia since their invasion of Ukraine. Non-US NATO spending is now over $400 billion a year, far above Russia's roughly $120 billion, or even China's estimated $300 billion. Meanwhile, on the Asian side of the Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and Australia combine for an estimated $130 billion in military spending. While the purpose of these military expenditures is for the national interests of the countries in question, these countries' military power has the effect of supplementing US military power due to the various alliances. Many of these countries also allow, often controversially, American military bases on their soil. Listening stations in Australia, naval bases in Djibouti and Bahrain, air bases in Germany and Honduras, and literally hundreds of other installations around the world. Most, though not all, in NATO or major non-NATO countries. They form a critical network for American power by allowing force projection almost anywhere in the world. To summarize, the United States of America's foreign policy is predicated on a system of international law, a global capitalist system with itself at the center of trade and monetary policy, alongside a network of alliances to protect those economic interests and allow for military force projection anywhere in the world. And Trump and his administration fail to see almost all of that because of how they approach foreign policy and international relations. As I outlined in the beginning, there are three main facets to the Trump administration's approach: treating foreign policy as transactional, operating from the assumption the world is zero-sum, and the manner in which they understand power. Treating foreign policy as transactional may seem odd as the first on this list. At a glance, it would seem like that is how nations engage with each other, transactionally. I get something in exchange for something else, or I get something in exchange for not hurting you. But that isn't actually how foreign policy really works. There's an analogy presented by Sarah Payne, professor at US Naval War College, called half-court tennis. This is when you are only paying attention to what is happening on your side of the metaphorical net. To bring up an example from the last video, the Trump administration's pullback of support from Ukraine. Beyond administration sympathies towards Russia, a lot of this is simply approaching the situation from the following mindset. We're giving all this money to Ukraine, and we, the United States, aren't getting anything out of it right now. Therefore, we should get out of this as soon as possible. But we should also use the leverage we currently have to get Ukraine to sign over their mineral rights. Here's where the half-court tennis metaphor comes in. The United States, Ukraine, and Russia aren't the only actors in the world. By taking this approach to Ukraine, their ally, how will all of the USA's other allies respond? How will the USA's other enemies respond? Or even how will Ukraine respond? By only viewing this one transaction, Trump and his administration aren't taking into account how the USA's foreign policy in this situation will impact the way other nations in the world respond to the United States going forward, or how the situation between Ukraine and Russia will impact other areas of US interest. In short, successful nations don't just look at one deal in front of them. They consider the impact that it will have on all of their current and future deals, because it's not just about one deal, one transaction. It's about a total overall policy. This also ties into the belief that the world is inherently zero-sum. We see this in the way that Trump conceptualizes trade. He looks at the trade imbalance between the United States and the rest of the world and concludes the US is losing. We as a country are spending more money on foreign goods than they are spending on ours. Therefore, we're the loser. That's not really how global trade works, especially for the United States, as I mentioned earlier in this video. And it's not how alliances work either, but that's the same attitude Trump takes towards US allies, that they take advantage of us, that they don't pull their own weight. An example of another member of the administration taking this attitude was Pete Hegseth when he told Europe they would have to stand on their own. This is a complete failure to understand how both the USA and European countries mutually benefit from the NATO alliance, even if the United States is doing most of the heavy lifting. In fact, one could argue in some ways the United States benefits more from doing the heavy lifting. But the point is, the idea that both sides could win in a deal doesn't cross Trump's mind. In his worldview, there is only one winner. That also ties a bit into the transactional mindset I mentioned before. He's just looking to win each individual deal. There isn't an overarching foreign policy, just win each deal, never thinking about how stiffing one nation will make it harder to negotiate with the next one. Which brings us to Trump and his administration's view on power. That it is imposed on others and should be wielded often. This mindset is not limited to their foreign policy either. It can be seen clearly in how the Trump administration operates domestically as well. It's a very authoritarian mindset, and also exhibits a level of understanding of foreign policy that amounts to, if you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. A few days before I began writing this script, Trump had threatened Iran with bombing the likes of which they have never seen before, if they didn't agree to a deal on stopping their nuclear weapons program. Now, I could point out how the Obama administration, after years of negotiations, actually got a deal that paused Iranian nuclear weapon development, which Trump unilaterally ended during his first term in office, which led the Iranian government to restart their program. But that isn't really the point here. The point is that in order to get Iran to do what he wants, Trump is threatening them with war. By the same token, in order to acquire Greenland, his administration is threatening to invade an American ally. To get better trade deals, Trump's go-to is to hit the other country with tariffs. In each of these examples, it is Trump and his administration wielding hard power with the intent of forcing the other country to give them a specific result. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, all tools are on the table, and the United States pre-Trump has certainly not been above using the threat of force to get what they wanted. However, at least since World War II, the United States has also regularly used the carrot, not just the stick. When you want reliable allies and reliable trading partners, it behooves you to treat them well. Consider how much less force the USA needed to maintain NATO than the USSR needed to maintain the Warsaw Pact. On the flip side, consider how couing the popular Iranian government in the 1950s ultimately played out for the US in the 1970s, and through the present day. By failing to understand power does not only come from imposing one's will, but from willing cooperation, Trump and his administration are taking a wrecking ball to the very foundations of not just American geopolitical power, but US and global stability and economic prosperity. And why does Trump and his administration fail to understand this? Because on a fundamental level, they're bullies. This, more than anything else, might be the most important takeaway for understanding Trump and his team's motivations. They don't want to represent. They don't want to help. They want to rule. That attitude is brought into foreign policy when they want the world to grovel to the United States of America. They don't see allies with whom they mutually benefit. They see vassals and enemies taking advantage of them. A zero-sum world where you have to win every interaction, putting the other party in their place. Trump and his administration will continue to operate in this manner. The way they view the world all but guarantees that. But they're going to be in for a nasty shock. The United States of America has been the global superpower since the end of the Cold War. Trump and his team are going to learn that the USA hasn't been hegemon through their military strength alone, but because of the mutual cooperation of dozens of nations around the world. With the end of that mutual cooperation, so will end US hegemony.